There's been a lot of less than stellar coverage lately from the press about the state of the podcasting industry. Despite all of that, we at the Sounds Profitable podcast remain not only hopeful, but committed to growth. Today, we're discussing streaming ad insertion and how Spotify has a big opportunity here.
Special thanks to our partners for making Sounds Profitable possible. Check them out by going to soundsprofitable.com and clicking on their logos in the articles.
Welcome to the Sounds Profitable podcast. I'm Arielle Nissenblatt. On the show today, I'm chatting with Brian Barletta and Tom Webster about their thoughts on whether or not Spotify can make streaming ad insertion stick. We'll get into that. What is streaming ad insertion? What's Spotify's role in the future of audio and podcasting? How it can have ripple effects and so much more. But first, Tom and Brian, how are things in your necks of the woods? We were all at the Veritonic Audio Intelligence Summit last week. How did that go for you two?
I enjoyed it, and I took a couple of things away. Probably the two biggest things I took away were, number one, we're going to be talking about Spotify a little bit more, just how much cool data Spotify really has. John Gibbs from Spotify presented some things about kind of the velocity of content types and types of podcasts that are requested at various times of the year, right? There's the obvious things like football podcasts were big around the Super Bowl, but even things like astrology podcasts are bigger when Mercury is in retrograde and things like that. They have so much cool data that they can tie to specific topics and genres that I would have a field day in there. The flip side of that, and this is not necessarily directed to anyone specifically, I think this industry continues to struggle explaining itself in simple terms, especially when it comes to the value of what we do for advertisers and kind of the value exchange between brand and agency and publisher and all that. I do think there's still some struggles in that explanation. But other than that, I mean, it was a good time.
Yeah, it was a really good event, and I think Tom hit on some really key things there. I mean, the panel I was on was with Policy Genius and Ad Results Media, and it was interesting, like navigating through the words that they use versus the words that we use for advertising and success and different types of delivery. I mean, I think that right now we're dealing with the fact that digital display advertising is very transactional and less personal, and things like social media influencer marketing is very much anchored on the idea of the individual, the celebrity, the endorsement. And podcasting, while it definitely leans more that way, is figuring out that middle area. And like Tom said, we're not really doing a great job of explaining, what we're doing or where the value is. And if we don't clarify with the person we're working with which way we're leaning for that specific activity, I think it's very easy for them to have one perception while we're gunning for another and making it really, really difficult to stick. So I think last year having more in-person meetings kind of started to shine on that. We're seeing more brands and advertisers start to get interested in talking with us in these public spaces. So I hope that Sounds Profitable can be a big part of bringing those voices public and airing that confusion in a way that the leaders in the space can kind of action on. What about you? You were there too. You were a big part of it, walking through the crowd, keeping conversations going. You introduced me to a bunch of people. No, I mean, to me, that's my favorite part. Being up on stage and listening to panels are fun, but the socializing and meeting all the people and making connections are my favorite part. So how did you enjoy that?
I loved the event. I had never been to an event like that before, one that was not quite a podcast event, not quite a podcast industry event. It was like an advertising event, sort of. But I thought, I know people here. I want to go. And I just want to shout out the venue was beautiful.
So great.
Like really beautifully organized. And then especially cool was the fact that outside of the window, there was a huge ad display for all of the brand partners for the event. And it was, all of New York City could see it. This was in Midtown Manhattan. And I stood staring out the window, taking a video for like a minute, because I just thought I just really geek out at like the wider public being exposed to podcast related, audio related advertisers and just growing the pie, right? Wasn't that cool?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of using digital outdoor to promote podcasts. I think you get a captive audience. It's super targeted. I think, and it's also, there are ways to measure digital outdoor pretty effectively. And I think, putting outdoor ads for podcasts in areas that are contextually relevant is just such an underused strategy to promote.
And I like when people do that, when everyone's going to an event, even if that event's not the biggest thing that's happening there. I believe pod sites for a podcast movement evolutions, like specifically ran ads in the airport at like luggage terminals and whatnot around one of the events. Wow. And, I've definitely been to events that, the ads are bought out in the elevator or in the lobby or like the stores on the way there or the out of home kiosks on the way there. I kind of like seeing people flex their advertising chops to show you how it works, to show you like the multi-touch nature of it. And that's really cool that this was one of the first like non-podcast industry events you went to. These are really fun for me. I mean, I think the further away we get from just talking about the creation of podcasts. And
this is a big thing you've been pushing lately.
Yeah. I think we do a really good job at supporting the creators. And I think a lot of the creators can take advantage of digital assets and resources way easier than we can on the business side. I absolutely tune out about an hour into anything digital on the business side because the value for me isn't necessarily the person on stage. It's the questions I can ask them afterwards. It's the conversations I can have with the person sitting next to me about that presentation. So that was the perfect environment. And Veritonic did a really killer job at making this not a branded event. Like it didn't feel like Veritonic's event. It felt like the Audio Intelligence Summit. So this is their second year. I really hope they continue to do it. And I plan to be there every year if they do.
All right, let's pivot. Let's talk about Spotify. Let's talk about streaming ad insertion. First, let's break down some terms. Today, we're discussing an article, Brian, that you wrote recently for Sounds Profitable called, Can Spotify Make Streaming Ad Insertion Stick? My first question for you and Tom, both of you, what is streaming ad insertion? And more importantly, how does it differ from dynamic ad insertion?
In Spotify's app, because they control the app and because they have access to the hosting platform or a relationship with the hosting platform, in this case, they do own Megaphone, they're able to identify where the publishers determine the ad should be. And instead of putting the ads into the MP3 itself and sending it to the listener on Spotify, they send the audio and something that identifies where those ad breaks are so that the app, when it gets to those breaks, can make a call from the listener's device for an in-app audio ad. So that makes it a streaming ad. The podcast is still progressively downloaded. It follows all the standards of podcasting, but the ads are left out of it and are handled specifically by the app itself, which makes it more digital because Spotify can close that loop.
Yeah, and the other thing that's kind of key about it is that it travels a well-worn groove as far as advertising goes. It's a path that that Pandora and Spotify and a lot of other streaming audio providers have been treading for some time now. It's an easy sale. It's an easy sale to broadcast buyers because it behaves like broadcast media, and yet it is digital and it is fully trackable and targetable. So it's a bit more mature in some ways, and it's something that I think a lot of buyers can get pretty easily.
So Spotify released this product, the streaming ad insertion, in early 2020. So it's been a little bit more than 3 years. Has anybody since then created a similar product, a competitor?
No, I mean, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and Google are the only four who could pull it off. Apple doesn't have a hosting platform that they work with, and they're not really focused on the ads. They're focused more on subscriptions and probably in-app ads driving to podcasts in their future. Amazon's taking a very different approach. They focus more on bundling things in with Amazon Music and Prime, so people get benefits that way. And Google, I'm working on an article as we record this, or I guess before and after we record this, about Google's play with Google Podcasts and YouTube. And the short is that YouTube would be primed to do this too, but it would be a little bit outside the box for them today. But they're the closest to being able to action on this in the same way that Spotify is.
Another question that came up for me as I was listening to this article, I have been fully listening to the Sounds Profitable articles. I skim through it when I receive the email, but then I mostly listen. I wonder what the case is for most people who listen to this podcast. If you're a reader or if you're a listener, please do let us know. Can a publisher place ad markers on their show that'd call for both streaming ad insertion and dynamic ad insertion? This is more just like me trying to understand the situation.
On like a technical level, yeah, I mean, that's all handled appropriately in the Megaphone platform, but they haven't exposed that for publishers to take advantage of. It was something that they had talked about for a long time. I mean, they made it available for all of Spotify's owned and operated inventory. And then they had always talked about what was originally called Megaphone Targeted Marketplace, then became Spotify Ad Network. The goal was for all the publishers on Megaphone who had opted into that to allow their inventory that is sold by Megaphone and Spotify through their DAI network to make it available through this SAI, the streaming ad insertion. And then the further plan from there was to enable them to potentially serve it themselves. Because the truth of it is if I am a major publisher and I empower Spotify to sell my inventory in a way that I can't, then no one is going to buy it from me directly. They're only going to buy it from Spotify. That's what happened with the Nielsen targeting that Megaphone was doing. It was something that they had as part of Megaphone Targeted Marketplace, and publishers said, I'm very open to that, but I need to be able to serve it myself, which led to Megaphone allowing publishers to do that at a cost per 1,000 downloads of about $5 CPM, right? And so that made it so that if Spotify enabled the publisher to do that, the publisher had the competitive advantage there that Spotify did, but Spotify also made money. And that's kind of my pitch here, is that Spotify could easily make this available, not only in Megaphone, in Anchor, in Whooshkaa, whether or not that's been absorbed fully, I'm not quite clear. But this is something that any hosting platform and Spotify could do. There's nothing unique about Megaphone doing it other than Spotify owns all the pieces.
So one question that I have, and this is for you, Brian, because I don't really know the answer to this. Let's say that a publisher did this and they were able to place markers for streaming ad insertion and dynamic ad insertion for various business reasons, and they sold both. On the back end of that, they get some reporting and they get some metrics. Do they look different? And does one of them make you yearn for the other? Does one of them look better, basically, to a publisher?
Yeah, I mean, the streaming ad insertion becomes off of listens, right? If you have, let's say, for example, you had a pre-roll, 2 mid-rolls, and a post-roll, and you directly sold all your post-roll, but in this world, you're able to make all of your pre-roll and 2 mid-roll available for streaming ad insertion, and then you were to serve and sell those differently. There absolutely is a world where the download nature of that post-roll, the download nature of podcast is a higher number than the listen number, the streaming ad insertion number that we would see for the pre-roll and the 2 mid-roll. I think the bigger part of that becomes the ability to raise the price. Spotify does sell streaming ad insertion at a higher price than dynamic ad insertion. I don't necessarily know if it's going to increase the overall net revenue for publishers, but I do believe that it would be high enough to accommodate for the potential drop in seeing that listens don't go as far as downloads, right? Listens are probably somewhere around half or a little bit more of downloads. So the metrics would be comparable. We'd be able to blend them. I mean, Spotify's done a good job at doing that. But I think it would be a transition point we'd have to go through, just like when we moved from IAB v1 to IAB v2, which was a 5-minute window to a 24-hour window for when a download was considered unique. And it definitely dropped people's numbers. I mean, this will reduce what we consider for available inventory, but it will empower and defend against our ability to represent it as a digital medium instead of something closer to, like you said earlier, out of home or broadcast TV or radio. It'll truly act like a digital medium.
Let's zoom out a little bit. I want to get some larger context around this article. So, Brian, you were interested in writing this article after a string of recent doom and gloom coverage about the podcast industry sort of came about. I think right when 2023 hit, there were article after article after article that was like, is podcasting doomed? Is podcasting dead? How does this fit into all that?
Spotify's lost a lot of leadership, and I'm not clear why people are just focusing on one side of it, other than it's just easy, right? You look at their purchases, and I can explain what Gimlet is easier than I can explain what Podsights is. So when I'm talking to a general audience, it's probably really low-hanging fruit. But Spotify bought a lot of technology. I think buying production is really tough. I think buying a studio and making it exclusive or making those shows exclusive, I think that was a gamble. I think Spotify bought a lot of information there, right? We can't just throw it away and say they wasted money because I think we learned something about podcasting. The open nature is resilient. We talk about how other companies and other industries are coming in to pick pieces away of podcasting, but the core of podcasting is people who like the medium or like these shows and want to get it where they're used to. They're not interested in the world that they're seeing in streaming where they need Netflix and HBO and Hulu and all those other services. They like having it in something, I don't know, personal to them. And so it wasn't working with the exclusive nature. Also, there's so much content out there. I think that buying shows right now or buying production companies is going to be a hard sell. I mean, there's so much amazing content out there that could be grown just a little bit more with a little bit of attention because it's such great production quality. And then these companies can sell into them, keeping 30% of the revenue, giving the publisher 70%, making it a hard sell for why you should have that person on your payroll instead of just paying them when you get ads. So I think the doom and gloom was justified to a degree, but it's only looking on one side of our space. And I think we as podcasting, I don't think we're an industry built up of people with a lot of experience outside of podcasting. And for those of us who do have it, I think that we're so surrounded by it that we sometimes forget what's going on in those other spaces. So I wanted to highlight the things happening in ad tech. I wanted to highlight the things happening in content creation elsewhere and really make sure that we realize that like this isn't unique to us. We're just kind of the belle of the ball, right? We're way more fun to talk about than CTV and Netflix having ads in there, right? Even if people want to make fun of us. But the hard part is that we're gonna take some hits because of it.
Yeah, you make a good point that a lot of people in podcasting have only been in podcasting. I personally, my only, I guess, industry that I was part of beforehand is Jewish nonprofits. Like I worked at a ton of Hebrew schools and then moved into podcasting. So I'd love to hear from other people, you know, where were you before and how does your prior experience affect what you do in audio now? Tom, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think, first of all, there's just equal doom and gloom with Jewish nonprofits. We can get into that.
Honestly. Yeah.
No, I the thing about podcasting and why we're seeing a lot of these articles is that people care about podcasting, right? I mean, you're not seeing these articles about radio and TV because honestly, radio has had a bad decade. Broadcast TV has had a bad decade. But the one thing I would point out is that, yeah, there's certainly going to be some corrections and some, right sizing is the euphemism that people like to use. I've never liked that. But there is one thing that podcasting is doing that so many other media are not, and that is growing audience. Like, regardless of how the monetization aspect and the ad market goes, we're still building listeners. There's still more people, more humans listening to podcasts today than there were a year ago and the year before that and the year before that. I mean, even when the market looks flat, the population's growing. And flat is not necessarily down, right? And it's largely been up and largely continues to go up. So as long as we are continuing to grow audience and continuing to grow time spent listening to podcasts, then I think the monetization of it is a trailing variable, and it's going to catch up again.
Brian, you wrote in this article that, quote, all of the pieces are in place for SAI to become the default advertising technology in podcasting, end quote. What needs to happen in order for this to be true?
Spotify could turn this on their hosting platforms today for their publishers, allowing them to sell direct or even just the first step of allowing all of their inventory to be available through SAI with the promise of selling direct. I think a lot of publishers would opt into that near term because really at the end of the day, what they want is more ad revenue. So I think that with the promise of even 6 or 12 months down the line, a lot of publishers would immediately turn that on and allow Spotify to do that. So whatever technical limitation is there, I mean, they're able to do it for their owned and operated. They're able to blend it together. There's no reason they can't turn it off. I'm not saying that the math to blend the two together is going to be trivial, but I'm saying that they've clearly done it. So there's room for us to explore that here. From there, Spotify could choose to open it up as a framework and allow any hosting platform to opt their inventory in to SAI as well. Now, I wrote about that there's a bunch of hosting platforms that are already connected through a VAS tag for DAI for Spotify Ad Network. So that first step is already there. Like I believe Libsyn and Red Circle and Triton all have relationships where their inventory is now available in Spotify ad networks. So doing that integration with a hosting platform says if the user agent is Spotify, send additional information and don't fill the ads is just as possible, right? It removes the ability for that hosting platform to say like Spotify didn't have an ad, serve something else, but it also empowers Spotify to say we don't have an ad, call something programmatically. In those same pipes, they could also offer the ability for the publisher to serve it direct. Spotify could charge a CPM fee to enable publishers to do that. And I don't think it would be unrealistic for that to be as high as $5 CPM to do that because of what they're enabling. And, you know, I think I am trivializing it a little bit, but all the pieces are there. And I think the hunger and appetite is there because people are looking for unique ways to sell their inventory today. And there's a lot of inventory. So if Spotify, who purchased Megaphone because they were the most successful ad selling team in podcasting, had access to more of this in their unique value proposition, then they would be able to sell to more advertisers, bringing them into the space. And now instead of that advertiser coming up to a podcast directly and saying, well, I liked it SAI with Spotify, I'll pay less and do a DAI with you, that publisher can say, well, actually, I can also support SAI, which then leads into an amazing kind of flywheel of if my show was 50-50 Apple and Spotify, well, if I'm making more money on my inventory in Spotify, I'm going to not say wherever you get your podcast, I'm going to say you can find this and all of our other shows on Spotify, right? Because I want to drive people to there. Every single download on there, every impression on there becomes more valuable. And then, I mean, the interesting thing becomes is what percent of your inventory running on Spotify is enough for you to say, well, I don't actually want my podcast to be anywhere else because that 30% that's not on Spotify, I'm struggling to monetize and effectively giving people an ad-free version of the show, which isn't great for our image. And I don't want to maintain a 5 or 10 person team specifically to sell 30% of our inventory when they could be focused on the SAI aspect. So I think everything is right there. I don't think it's terribly complicated. And I think the industry will be really open to it. And this is what I meant by RSS Plus, right? This is using the base technology and just saying, if this variable exists, then send more information.
Tom, what's Spotify's next move here? What do you think they can do to take advantage of this moment? And where does the product need to go in order to help the industry overall? Because, of course, Spotify is in it for Spotify, but ultimately, if the industry grows, Spotify grows. So what's next?
Yeah, it's not so much a technical challenge, I think, as it is a business development, channel development, partner relationship challenge for them as much as anything. Spotify has aggressively kind of vertically integrated itself, right, with the acquisitions of Megaphone and Chartable and Pod Sites, and they're in possession of all this data, and they are essentially, they're not neither fish nor fowl. They are fish and fowl at the same time. They are both publisher and platform, and so I think other publishers need to be reassured that Spotify is not going to be using their data against them, right? I mean, I think we have seen in the past, Bill Simmons with The Ringer mentioning that all of this great data helps them decide on shows and things like that. And I think the thought of someone at Spotify having a look under the hood at what shows are actually bubbling up to be more popular or shows that are bubbling up with some velocity, and then poaching those shows or picking those shows off, I think that's a concern that some people have. So I think there's a relationship challenge there. And, we talk about things like clean rooms in relation to, cookies and advertising and things like that. But maybe that's the kind of assurances that Spotify needs to give to people, because the platform itself, as Brian has written so eloquently, is extremely intriguing.
Awesome. Any closing thoughts on the future of SAI and DAI and how they might be able to work together to propel this industry forward?
I don't think we're hampered by DAI being the only solution or main solution, but I think we are hurt by Spotify having this small sliver of a solution that they're even not fully committing to. So I guess it's kind of like a, do or die type of situation right now. I think that having both formats in the way they are right now, where only a little bit of inventory can be done through SAI, is probably more damaging than ending it completely or kind of positioning it as the solution. And Spotify's original marketing on it really said that this is the future of podcasting. And I think I presented a really good case on how it could be and how we could all buy into it. And it doesn't have to be Spotify just taking. So I really hope, and judging by the number of people from Spotify who signed up for Sounds Profitable since writing it, that they take it to heart. And Tom and I are very eager to work with companies like Spotify to grow the space. And this would grow the space.
Listeners, if you have not yet read the article that Brian wrote called Can Spotify Make Streaming Ad Insertion Stick? You can find it on our website, soundsprofitable.com, or you can listen to the audio version of this article in this very podcast feed. Before we close out this episode, let's talk about some upcoming events that Sounds Profitable will be present at. First up, we've got Podcast Movement. What are we doing at Podcast Movement?
We have an entire lounge there for all of our partners that will also have free and open sessions at around 3 p.m. On Wednesday and Thursday to do some networking and to talk about some cool things about the industry. But all of our partners are able to use that space for semi-private business meetings because the event itself is a little bit far away from the Vegas Strip, and we'd love to help everybody stay as close as possible for the duration of the event.
And Podcast Movement Evolutions, that is March 7 through 10 in, as you said, Las Vegas. Then just a few days later is South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. What's happening there?
We have a really cool venue called Cenote, and it is going to be a little bit more casual than what we normally do for our quarterly business summits. But Tom is going to present some research, which I'll let him talk about in a second. And we're going very heavy on inviting brands, advertisers, agencies, and holding companies to attend, because that's a big part of South by Southwest, right? And the reason we're there is to interact with larger communities, larger content creation communities, larger advertising and audio communities. And South by Southwest is our first step forward out of just associating with podcasting events to really remind the greater advertising ecosystem that we exist and their money should be spent here.
And we are going to be presenting a brand new piece of research. I'm as excited about this as anything that we've done so far. We're going to be looking at the top brands in terms of advertising in podcasting, radio, and television. The 5 brands in each that had the most kind of frequency over the past 6 months or so, and looking at the differences that a podcast only audience feels about a brand that's only advertised in podcasting as compared to a brand that advertises in television and so on. Some of these brands advertise in both. So we've got brands in there, everything from podcasting stalwarts like BetterHelp to some of the big insurance companies. McDonald's is in there. So we're looking at basically kind of a comparative cross-media brand lift study that kind of looks at the power of each of these various media on promoting the brand and some other kind of common brand metrics that we typically look at. And I think our expectation is that in a lot of these, podcasting is going to look very good. And I hopefully this is going to be a really good story for the industry when it comes out. And
the research presented at the Sounds Profitable Summit is going to be presented there first, but then available to the public later?
Yes, we're going to have a webinar. There'll be some information about that very, very soon. And of course, any of the research that we produce at Sounds Profitable, we make fully available for free for the entire industry so that they can use it as a resource, put it in their media kits, put it in their sales kits, or just frame it on the wall. It's suitable for living rooms and parlors.
And with the Sounds Profitable's new branding, it is gorgeous.
We'll even do signed copies.
Hey listeners, we would love your feedback. Please reach out if you have any questions or comments. I'm on Twitter at @ReThisAndThat. Brian's at Brian Barletta. And to tag Sounds Profitable in your tweets, praising our episodes and or articles, we're at Sounds Prof News. We're also on LinkedIn. Just search for Sounds Profitable. If you want to send us an email, you can reach us at podcast@soundsprofitable.com.
This episode was recorded remotely using Squadcast, the best way to capture high-quality audio and video from anywhere with anyone at any time. We use Squadcast for our podcast and all of our product deep dives. To try it out for yourself, go to squadcast.fm and start a free trial. Use code SPPartners, that's SP Partners all together, to extend that trial.
To access our articles, product deep dives, the Podscape, our research, and a lot more, head to our brand spanking new and shinily designed website at soundsprofitable.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sounds Profitable Podcast with me, Brian Barletta.
Me, Tom Webster.
And me, Ariel Nisselat.
This episode is put together using Schooler. It's edited by Reese Carman and Ron Tendick, and it's hosted on Art19.